So let's cover a few discussion questions that I thought of as I was creating this arbitrary static actor class. The first one being, can we make this look any better? I mean, these kind of cruddy little green polygons don't look a whole lot fancier than the debug draw stuff we had way back in the very first section. And that's because we're really just drawing these sprites with some very primitive drawing tools and fill tools and that kind of thing. So I guess one way we can make it look better is just to get a little fancier with our action script. Maybe it's doing some gradient fills or some bitmap fills and adding a nice little bevel filter and a glow and a drop shadow or something to the sprites we create. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of making our actors look a little better is pass along a sprite that we want the actor to use instead of drawing something by hand. So I'll show you what I mean. I kind of did this in our Puggle application just for example. So if we look at my library, I created this thing I'm calling diagonal thing. It's basically a hand-drawn version of the ramp that's going down and to the right. And you can see I basically kind of added on some orange squiggles so that we can identify it later, and I happen to make sure that this matches up with the shape of the sprite that we're using for our ramps on the left-hand side. If we check out the properties of this thing, you can see that the class is called diagonal thing. Its base class is sprite, so that we can actually instantiate one of these things in ActionScript later. And then if we jump over to my arbitrary static actor class, what I've done is I've added a fourth parameter to the constructor. So we've still got our parent, our location, the list of lists of coordinates that we're going to be using. But then I also pass in a fourth parameter called sprite to use. That's basically going to be a class, and it defaults to null. And what I've done here in my constructor code is I said, well, all right, if sprite to use isn't null, then my sprite is simply going to be a new one of those. Add it to the parent, and we've magically created a sprite from the library instead of having to draw one by hand. And then we'll jump over into our Puggle class, and you can see that when I've created my left ramp now, I still have the same first three parameters, and my fourth parameter is that diagonal thing class that we created in Flash. And so, long and short of it being, when I run all of this, what we end up getting is pretty much the same thing as before, except now you can see that the artwork for my ramps on the left-hand side are actually the sprites that are in my library. So obviously this example only works because I knew in advance what the dimensions of this ramp were going to be, and I was able to hand create a crappy looking, but in theory a nice looking sprite in my library that I could use. And so if you were to make a game where, say, you had a bunch of different rocks that you wanted to scatter throughout your level and you wanted them to be static, you could probably do something like this if you knew what all the rocks looked like beforehand. You could create them in your library, and then you could basically create different arbitrary static actors where the set of coordinates happens to match up with this nice looking rock you have in your library. So this is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, and the way I ended up doing it in the Puggle application you saw at the very beginning, is to burn it into the background. In other words, I actually don't draw the sprite at all. Or actually, I think technically I draw the sprite and then I set its visibility to false. In other words, I have something that looks a little like this. And look at this, my arbitrary static actor has magically changed so that this fourth parameter is now a Boolean flag that basically just says, should the sprite be visible? And down here, I just check and say, all right, if the visible sprite is not true, set the sprite's visibility to false. Just for sanity's sake, I still go through the trouble of creating the sprite and even adding it, because I figure at some point there's going to be some time when I check the bounds of the sprite, and if I don't create it at all, I'm gonna hurt myself later. So you might be tempted, by the way, if you follow a format like this, to not create the sprite at all. I think you're probably safer creating the sprite and just setting its visibility to false like I did. And then back in my Puggle application, my fourth parameter for these left ramp coordinates is now set to false. And when I run it, I get something that looks like this. So there we go. And now you can see my ball is bouncing off of those invisible ramps on the left-hand side. Obviously, in this example, it doesn't look very good because, well, it's invisible. But if I had a very nicely drawn background where these ramps were painted into the background the way the original Peggle application did, it would look very nice. And that's basically what I've done here. You know, these ramps, they were just built right into the background, and so I do have an arbitrary static actor class, and I've just turned its visibility flag to false. If you want to create your own beautifully drawn background and turn off the visibility of your arbitrary static actors, be my guest. Since I didn't want us to go through that hassle in our tutorial programs, I'm going to turn the visibility back on and just stick with our ugly green polygons for now. But at least hopefully you have a few ideas as to what you could do to make them look a little nicer.